Chapter 2, Surveying the Territory. One look is worth 100 reports. Japanese proverb. President Kalinin was telling a group in Moscow about the marvelous accomplishments of Russia under communism. In glowing terms, he described the new 20-story skyscrapers on Karl Marx Street in Kharkov. But Comrade Kalinin, spoke up an old man in the audience, I've lived in Kharkov for the last 50 years. At night, after supper, I walk down Karl Marx Street with my wife and children, and we've never seen the skyscrapers. That's the trouble with workers like you, Kalinin interrupted angrily. You waste your time walking the streets instead of reading the newspapers and finding out what is going on in your country. How do we get our verbal maps? We have a choice, first-hand or second-hand. We can survey the territory ourselves and make our own verbal maps, or we can read or talk to other people and get our maps secondhand. Some of the time, we get into trouble because we do not take advantage of the experiences of other people. We don't profit by the wisdom of the old-timers. But most of us have developed quite well the habit of using second-hand verbal maps, of relying on the knowledge and experiences of other people. We've acquired this habit so well that we have become lax in the process of surveying the territory ourselves and making our own verbal maps. This chapter, parentheses, and this entire book, will help you develop to a greater extent the ability and habit of making your own verbal maps. The limitations of maps. I visited the troops near Coutances on the 29th, wrote General George Patton, and found an armored division sitting on the road, while its headquarters, secreted behind an old church, was deeply engrossed in the study of maps. I asked why they had not crossed the sign. They told me they were making a study of it at the moment, but could not find a place where it could be forded. I asked what effort they had made to find such a place, and was informed that they were studying the maps to that end. I then told them that I had just waded across it, that it was not over 2 feet deep, and the only defense I knew about was one machine gun which had fired very inaccurately at me. I repeated the Japanese proverb, "One look is worth 100 reports," and asked them why in hell they had not gone down to the river personally. They learned the lesson, and from then on were a very great division. As Patton pointed out, maps may be a poor substitute for actually surveying the territory ourselves. Patton did not criticize the map the division leader was using. Those maps were probably accurate and quite adequate as far as they went. Patton criticized his failure to supplement the map with his own observations. When you have to do it. Most of the time, We don't have the opportunity to survey the territory for ourselves. We just have to rely upon the maps of others. For instance, we know from history books that Columbus began the tourist service to America in 1492. You and I can't map this territory for ourselves. It took place hundreds of years before we were born, and we must accept the maps of other people whom we believe are qualified to inform us reliably. When a skilled mechanic in whom I have confidence tells me my car needs new piston rings, there is a limit to how far I care to poke my head inside the engine to check on his verbal map. If you tell me that the Sharpo razor blades are the dullest things you've ever seen, I probably won't insist on trying them out for myself. If you inform me that the food at the Dewdrop Inn is awful and the service even worse, I'll plan to eat somewhere else tonight. When we think it worthwhile to rely on the verbal maps of another person, we should pick someone who is well qualified to advise us. If it is an important matter, we might check his verbal maps with those of others whom we consider equally well qualified. We should remember that not even the greatest authority in any field dealing with practical matters is always right. Authorities are people who are on the beam most of the time, or at least more often than the average person. But they are human beings, and like all other human beings, at times authorities have been wrong and will continue to be wrong. Columbus, Robert Fulton, Thomas Edison, the Wright brothers, and many others you can name accomplished things that the authorities said were impossible. And today, more than ever before, great achievements await those who have the patience and guts to investigate things the authorities now take for granted. Remember that no one has yet found the net with which to ensnare truth once and for all. Truth is an elusive sprite that is hard to keep penned up. I'm going to pause to refresh. Perhaps that's the reason this shouldn't be live streamed, but should be an edited recording. To go on. We must use our own sense and senses. In our everyday business and personal affairs, we are dealing, usually, with things we can check for ourselves. But most of us have become so used to relying on the verbal maps of others that we have lost the precious habit of seeking first-hand knowledge. During our school days, we get used to soaking up second-hand verbal maps in order to spout them out at examination time. John Dewey, one of our leading philosophers and educators, wrote as long ago as 1898. The famous complaint of Agassiz that students could not see for themselves is still repeated by every teacher of science in our high schools and colleges. How many teachers of science will tell you, for example, that when their students are instructed to find out something about an object, their first demand is for a book in which they can read about it. Their first reaction, one of helplessness, when they are told that they must go to the object itself and let it tell its own story. It is not exaggerating to say that the book habit is so firmly fixed that many pupils, otherwise intelligent, have a positive aversion to directing their attention to things themselves. It seems so much simpler to occupy the mind with what someone else has said about these things. While it is mere stupidity not to make judicious use of the discoveries and attainments of others, the substitution of the seeing of others for the use of one's own eye is such a self-contradictory principle as to require no criticism. We only need to recognize the extent to which it actually obtains. That was from Education Today by John Dewey. Of course, all of us have some tendency towards surveying the territory for ourselves. Try putting up a wet paint sign and notice the response. For some reason or other, a wet paint sign seems to arouse a strong, quote, "I'm going to see it for myself," unquote, impulse. But when it comes to important business and personal matters, frequently we get into serious trouble because we do not use our own first-hand observations to check the second-hand maps we've picked up over the years. Think of some of the mistakes you have made. Almost every one is due to going by maps that do not adequately represent the territory. How often could you have, quote unquote, stayed out of hot water if you had gone to the trouble of surveying the territory yourself instead of depending on what someone else told you or on your own guesses? Perhaps 1/2 of the time? For each person, the answer will be different. You must decide for yourself up to what point you need to develop more of the quote unquote, "I'm from Missouri, you've got to show me" attitude. By the way, up to what point is one of the future tools for thinking. To resume, the scientific spirit. In January 1941, some Michigan conservation officers found a hunter busily engaged in tearing down a sign just put up on a post in the forest. They asked the hunter if he knew what he was doing. "Sure," he replied angrily. "I'm tearing down these signs that say a man can't hunt on land bought by the Conservation Department." "Did you actually read the sign?" asked an officer. "Well, I'll be darned," the hunter exclaimed disgustedly as he looked up and saw the lettering. "Hunting permitted," the sign read. No matter how much intelligence we may have, it is subject to a 50 to 100% discount if we don't have the habit of basing our maps on a careful survey of the territory. Pardon me. Aristotle, one of the greatest intellects of ancient Greece, wrote that there were 8 legs on a fly. Any fool could have corrected him by using his eyes and counting the 6 legs on a fly. And Aristotle was called the master of those who know. The learned Pliny said that at the approach of a menstruating woman, seeds would become sterile, plants would become parched, and the fruit would drop from the trees. Her very glance would dim mirrors, blunt knives, kill bees, and cause brass and iron to rust. Throughout this chapter, we have repeatedly emphasized this point. The best way to make adequate verbal maps is to survey the territory for yourself, to use your own sense and senses, to observe. But isn't that what scientists tell us to do? It is not by adequately surveying the territory that scientists achieve the remarkable predictability that characterizes their verbal maps. In fact, isn't surveying the territory the essence of the scientific method? When a scientist tries to find out which verbal map is the most adequate, he looks at the territory, he observes, he uses his senses, he opens his mind and his eyes. Non-scientific people try to settle problems by arguments and by armchair reasoning. For example, the scientific way to tell whether a cake tastes good is to eat it. The philosophical way is to analyze the recipe and psychoanalyze the cook. That is, do any and everything except actually survey the territory by tasting the cake. You will find the 6 tools for thinking presented in part 2 of this book offer you the easiest and most effective way that has yet been found to develop the scientific spirit in meeting your everyday life problems. Part 2 is 1 chapter away from us. In fact, when you learn to use these tools for thinking, you won't have to try to develop a scientific spirit. You'll automatically have it. Before you know it, the scientific way of thinking, which is the most effective technique for straight thinking known to man, will be giving you surprising and unexpected power in solving your personal and business problems. To sum up, men are apt to be much more influenced by words, said Pavlov, than by the actual facts of the surrounding reality. The habit of surveying the territory for ourselves helps us get the words out of our eyes. It keeps us from developing a parasitic mind that lives on second-hand maps made by others. The scientific way of making adequate verbal maps is to look at the territory instead of burying our nose too deeply in the reports of others. Once we learn to use the 6 tools for thinking presented fully in part 2, we will find that we have automatically acquired a scientific attitude in dealing with our everyday affairs. Phew, I'm going to take another pause to refresh here. And just to show you that we can change the video screen, I'm going to do a transition to it. And so that was chapter 2 of How to Develop Your Thinking Ability, which later became Taming Your Mind by Ken Keyes Jr. In the actual physical book, there are cartoons or drawings. Quite frequently, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of them in that chapter 2 that I just did. I feel like I should try to describe them for this recording. But I think it would be too difficult and perhaps not get across as well. So I will try to make them available in some form. As you may or may not know, these are audio recordings that are intended to become part of a documentary or book review or something to do with getting across general semantics, how to develop your thinking ability, since it is an attempt to make a practical version of general semantics. Seems like a good start, and I had a few people request an audio version of Taming Your Mind because they have an aversion to reading. I'm trying to think of what else to tell you in these notes. I guess I'll fill in anything else in the written description. It's September 22nd, 2002 at about 2:37 p.m. I'm going to put up the link to the text of Science and Sanity, which is the foundational book by Alfred Korzybski, which kind of lays out general semantics. It is unfortunately a somewhat difficult book to read for a few reasons, and Korzybski himself joked that the unabridged version of Science and Sanity needed its strong sewn cloth binding in order to survive having exasperated readers pitch their copies from high-story windows. But it is well worth reading. I suggest starting at chapter 1 because a few people that I've spoken to, and I think the majority of people who have attempted it that I know, got turned off by reading the 200 plus pages of forewords and prefaces to the various editions. So I think it's a good idea to just start with Korzybski trying to explain himself, or to start with How to Develop Your Thinking Ability or Taming Your Mind, which are intended as better introductions. Or you can get selections from Science and Sanity by Alfred Korzybski, which is a much shorter, easier book to get a hold of, both physically and from a marketing standpoint. It is in print, which the original Science and Sanity is not, and is not readily available all the time either. And when it is, it's sometimes a bit pricey, like $80 or $100. Selections from Science and Sanity is available on Amazon, and it's, I think, around $11 the last time I looked. So that's about it. Thank you for reading. And please subscribe if you want to, but I saved that for the end. Bye-bye.